Did a good job. You did better than I could do. Thank you, Micah. Appreciate you being here this morning. Zechariah, chapter number 4 today. Zechariah, chapter number 4. Going to continue on in our series, Major Truths from the Minor Prophets. And as you're turning to Zechariah, chapter number 4, I'm just going to share a little story with you. When Beverly and I first became homeowners, we were overseas. It was in Sweden. There was a sense of awkwardness and unfamiliarity when the first house you buy is not in the United States. And then, of course, we have our house now here in Middletown. And one thing that I really appreciate doing as a homeowner is DIY projects. And for various reasons. I think I just like working with my hands. And it's just fun to me. It's sort of relaxing until it's not. But you know that if you do any sort of DIY projects, if you're going to work around the house, you have to have what? What do you have to have? Yeah, you have to have skill. You have to have a know-how. You have to have knowledge. You have to have time. But what else do you have to do projects? Yeah, you have to have tools. You have to have tools. And for me, my preferred type of tool would be like a battery-powered tool. I can carry those around wherever. I can use them wherever. I don't have to be connected to an outlet or to this next thing I'll mention, that is air. Now, and you don't have to answer aloud, but think to yourself, what are air tools commonly referred to as? They are referred to as pneumatic power tools. Pneumatic. When we get into Zechariah chapter 4, there's a particular verse that stands out. And let's see which verse that is. The verse that I'm looking at is verse number 6, the second part where God says through this vision to Zechariah, not by might nor by power, but by my Spirit, saith the Lord of hosts. This is a very impactful sort of verse, and we're going to investigate it today, as well as the verses and the truths surrounding it. But when you start talking about the Spirit of God, the third person of the Trinity, the doctrine is called pneumatology. Pneumatology. And I always thought that was really strange that you'd have Christology and then theology, but then pneumatology, where did this word come from? Pneuma, P-N-E-U-M-A. And when you think of its use with maybe pneumatic power tools, pneuma refers to air or gas. So think this source of power and ability that's present, but you don't see it. You don't see it. There has to be a direct line, a direct connection to this source to actuate the tool, or else that tool is worthless. It's just a bunch of hunk of metal and plastic. And so for Major Truths from the Minor Prophets this morning, we'll be looking at this title, this subject, By My Spirit. Just a few introductory remarks concerning Zechariah to get our thoughts primed and reminded about where we are at in the Scriptures. Remember that Zechariah was a post-exile prophet. Not all of the minor prophets came after the exile. Many of them came before the exile, before the captivity in Babylon. Some of them, even while they were there. Zechariah was a post-exile prophet. And he ministered to Israel alongside Haggai and Ezra and even a few others. So he was a contemporary with other men of God in his day. And as I've said in the previous weeks, he is one of the most apocalyptic prophets in the entire Old Testament. Now, some of his prophecies, as you read them, they were fulfilled. They found their fulfillment in the person of Jesus Christ. At his incarnation, at his crucifixion, for instance, by his stripes we are healed. They looked on him whom they pierced. When was that fulfilled? When Jesus Christ was crucified. But some of his prophecies will find their ultimate fulfillment at the end of this age, when Jesus returns for his second advent, when he returns and comes again to establish his 1,000-year reign on the earth, referred to often as the millennium. His book is one of the longer books of the minor prophets, and within it are two general divisions. Maybe you could argue that there's a couple minor other ones, but there's two general divisions. You have chapters 1 through 8, which is where we find ourselves today. And in chapters 1 through 8, what you find are 8 night visions that are given, yes, by God, maybe through the form of an angel, but by God to Zechariah. And then chapters 9 through 14, they center around the first and the second coming of the Messiah. The first and second coming of the Messiah. So chapters 1 through 8 and then 9 through 14. When we get to Zechariah 4, we learn as we read throughout the chapter, it contains one of these night visions, a vision coming to Zechariah in the darkness. And within that vision, God sets forth some beautiful, beautiful, wonderful truths. So with that, let's just read verses 1 through 5. Zechariah chapter number 4 says this, "And the angel that talked with me came again and waked me as a man that is wakened out of his sleep." So see, it's a night vision. "And said unto me, What seest thou? And I said, I have looked, and behold, a candlestick all of gold, with a bowl upon the top of it, and his 7 lamps thereon, and 7 pipes to the 7 lamps, which are upon the top thereof, and 2 olive trees by it, one upon the right side of the bowl, and the other upon the left side thereof. So I answered and spake to the angel that talked with me, saying, What are these, my Lord? Then the angel talked with me, answered and said unto me, Knowest thou not what these be? And I said, No, my Lord." We're going to hit the candlesticks again. We're going to find them at the end of the chapter. And in that section, it refers to 2 pipes. So what I want you to envision right now is exactly what Zechariah is seeing in the middle of the night, in the darkness. He sees this lampstand, this candlestick. It would come up, and then there would be 7, 3 on each side, and then 1 in the middle. And when you get to the end of the chapter, you realize that there's these 2 olive trees, but each olive tree is giving 1 pipe. So 1 pipe coming from the left, 1 pipe coming from the right. And so when he talks about these 7 pipes, I want you to try to imagine 2 larger main pipes, and then they come into the top of it, and there they start to divide out and separate into these 7 pipes, supplying olive oil unto this candlestick or lampstand so that it can burn. And the candlestick in the vision, let's get a few things out of the way. It's an obvious allusion to the lampstand that would have been placed on the south side in the tabernacle or in the temple. So the Jews, they come out of Egypt. God gives the law. He gives the covenant. And he gives instruction to build this temple, this tabernacle, and to observe ceremonial sacrifices inside that temple, inside that tabernacle. And the lampstand, the tabernacle faced to the east, the opening was to the east, the lampstand go in to the left, means on the south side. And because the tabernacle was completely dark inside, light was needed in order to be able to see. There were animal skins draped over the entire tabernacle, so it was pitch black. It was dark. You had to have light, and so you had the candlestick or the lampstand. We understand today that everything in that tabernacle, you read the New Testament, here's what you learn. That the things given in the Old Testament, the things given in the Old Covenant, the things given that pertain to the worship in the tabernacle and the sacrifices and the instruments, what are they? They are shadows. All of them foreshadow and speak to that tabernacle in the heavenlies, where Jesus Christ serves as king and priest. They are foreshadows even to Jesus himself and the truths and the works that he has performed for us. So at this point, if you stop reading the rest of the chapter, you're probably left a little bit like Zechariah. No, I don't really understand what's going on. But at a minimum, it should be understood that God is showing forth some truth regarding His grace and His working, both its source and its power. I think enough is there for those things to at least be understood. But Zechariah was unsure of what exactly he was looking at. Probably some sort of understanding about maybe some things being implied, but he doesn't know exactly what he's looking at. What confused Zechariah were these two olive trees that appeared to be piping in oil into this lampstand, supplying it with fuel so that it could burn and make light. This was given to Zechariah, and subsequently, through Zechariah, would be given and written down for all of Israel to hear, in order to reveal truth regarding God's power and God's supply of grace. More will be explained as we go through these major points here. But let me say this. Just as Zechariah comes to this time, and God's attempting to speak to him and show him some things, he's a little confused. I would say this. There will be times in life, times in your faith community, your church, maybe times in your workplace, family, whatever, where you're confused. There's just some things that don't add up. Even when we turn to the Lord and we seek direction from Him, when we can sense that He is wanting to talk to us, and I'm not saying that we go outside of the bounds of His Word to receive revelation from God, but you know that something's at work, God's wanting to do something, but you can't really see clearly all the way, and you're left with question marks and a little bit confused, wondering, God, what are you doing? You're going to have to go into more detail and show me what's going on. We're left unsure of what's going on and what God may be attempting to reveal to us. We read through the rest of this passage. God's going to expound on this very vision and explain some things to Zechariah concerning Zerubbabel, the king at the time. There's three things we can do when we don't understand what God's doing. Here's the three things we'll look at today. Number one, rely on God's Spirit. Number two, rest in God's grace. And number three, trust in God's promises. Look with me there at verse number 6. Continues. Then he answered and spake unto me, saying, This is the word of the Lord unto Zerubbabel, saying, Not by might, nor by power, but by my Spirit, saith the Lord of hosts. God's people, you and I, all who believe, God's people have a purpose. They have a place. They all serve a part in the work of God and the work of the Lord. Zechariah was ministering at a peculiar day in Israel. Their first temple, the Temple of Solomon, the one that was grand and glorious, it had been utterly destroyed. And upon their return into the land, they get to work laying the foundation of a second temple. And that work had been halted. For about 17 years it was halted because of opposition, both within and without. This is when Zechariah is ministering. And God's giving these visions to him to relay to Zerubbabel, to relay to Joshua the high priest, to relay to the people, to encourage and incite some vigor into the depths of their soul. This was the case in Israel during Zechariah's day. It's also true today within the church. Everyone included has a part. Everyone has a place. Everyone has a purpose. God's people are given responsibility in His work and within the labor of the kingdom. But know this, my friend, God alone holds the power. He has the power. Notice those words there. Not by might, nor by power, but by my Spirit, saith the Lord of hosts. What's he referring to? He's talking about how is this temple going to be rebuilt? How are we going to get from foundation to walls to roof to finish? How's that going to come to place? This is what God's saying. Well, you're going to be involved. Everyone's going to have a part. Zerubbabel's going to have a part. Joshua's going to have a part. You're going to have to work. You're going to have to plan. But he starts it off saying this way, not by might, nor by power, but by my Spirit, saith the Lord of hosts. The message here is very simple. God's work would be done because His Spirit was superintending it and working in the midst of it all. No one else could really be accredited with the success of it. It was God, not man's might, not the power of the king or the rulers or the people. We cannot see Him. We cannot necessarily feel the Spirit of God, but He is ever present and He is ever working. Jesus referred to the Holy Spirit in John chapter 3. He's at a discourse with this man named Nicodemus. He's trying to explain to Nicodemus how someone is born again or saved. And he says this, Verily, verily, I say unto thee, except a man be born of water and of the Spirit, he cannot enter the kingdom of God. That which is born of the flesh is flesh, and that which is born of the Spirit is spirit. Marvel not that I said unto thee, ye must be born again. The wind bloweth where it listeth. Get this, look at the character of the Spirit of God. The wind bloweth where it listeth, and thou hearest the sound thereof, but canst not tell whence it cometh and whither it goeth. So is everyone that is born of the Spirit. Now, I'm not trying to get into the depth of John 3 other than to say this. You don't see the Spirit of God. You don't see Him with your eyes. You sense Him. You sense His presence through other senses. You see His work. You see and you know that He's there because things take place that are unexplainable, inexplicable outside of the movement of the Spirit of God. That's His character. How then are we to rely on His Spirit if we're unable to see Him? I would encourage you, if you're here this morning, be sensitive to His impulses and the pressure that He places upon the heart. You think about air tools. What do you set your tank to? You have to set it to a certain PSI for a particular tool to be able to shoot a nail or whatever it's doing. It has to have a certain amount of pressure. This book can bring conviction, the words of it. But I'm not going to sit here and shy away from the fact that there's times where I am pressed in the depths of my soul, in the depths of my spirit. It's not necessarily excluding the Word of God, but I know that God is purposefully weighing and putting a degree of pressure on me. He's wanting to get my attention. Be sensitive to that. Be sensitive to His Spirit. Recognize conviction for what it is. Be willing to listen to that still, small voice speaking ever so gently in your ear. To rely on God's Spirit means to know and trust that He is present, that He is active, and that He is powerful. Rely on God's Spirit. Number 2, 3 things we can do when we're not so sure what God's doing. We rely on God's Spirit. He's at work. Even if we don't see, He is working. Number 2, rest in God's grace. Rest in God's grace. Now, there are a couple reasons in verse 7 why we should rest in God's grace. Number 1, God's grace is greater. You're probably thinking, well, God's grace is greater than what? I'll explain. Verse number 7, he continues, Who art thou, O great mountain? Before Zerubbabel, thou shalt become a plain. In the work of the Lord and in the rebuilding of the temple, this grand project that they had set forth to do, Zerubbabel and the Jews, they faced mounting backlash from the opposing nations and the Gentile leaders that had remained in the land. Even though they had returned to the land, Zerubbabel is not even set up as king. He's kind of referred to as like the governor because they're not going to allow the Gentile leaders to be removed quite yet. So they're still under the thumb of Gentile nations. Here, God seems to refer to these non-Jewish leaders as great mountains that stood in the way of His work. And He says, Who art thou, O great mountain? Before Zerubbabel, before him, I'm going to let him see it. I'm going to flatten you out, and I'm going to turn you into a plain. who or what was going to trump God? No one and nothing. Who could ever thwart his purposes? Nobody. Nothing. Who could ever contain God and control him? No one. Certainly not these foreign leaders. In this passage, God declares his authority and his power. And I would say there's even a tinge of sarcasm in it when he says, "Who art thou, O great mountain?" Understand this, even though your life might not make sense at the moment, even though your situation seems to have no clear resolve, and even though you feel like you are up against a mountain, God's grace is far greater. Apply it to whatever, your individual life, your marriage, your relationships at work, your church, your citizenship, whatever you want to apply it to, know this: God's grace is greater than the opposition and the obstacles. It's greater. God's grace is greater than your biggest enemies who speak big words. What is it to God but a bunch of hot air? God's grace is greater than your worst sin. God's grace is greater than your most challenging circumstances and situations. You're wanting to grow, you're wanting to build, you're wanting to see your life and your relationships and your church community build up, and there seems to be opposition in the way. Let me tell you, God is greater than those mountains. He's going to flatten them like a pancake because nothing's going to stand in his way. Not if you rely on his Spirit and rest in his grace. God's grace is greater than your darkest worries and your deepest fears. God's grace is greater than the devil that casts doubt into your soul. God's grace is greater than all of it. And not only is God's grace greater, but the second reason why we should rest in God's grace is because God's grace is in abundant supply. Abundant supply. He continues on there in verse 7, "And he shall bring forth the headstone thereof with shoutings, crying, Grace, grace unto it." Now, before we get to the grace, grace unto it part, God's grace being in abundant supply, notice what he says, "And he shall bring forth the headstone thereof with shoutings." You say, man, what's going on? Headstone's not being used the way we would think of it, like in a cemetery or a graveyard. What he's saying there is, Zerubbabel, this same leader that I'm working in and I'm working through, who has helped with the laying of the foundation, I'm going to intervene. My Spirit's going to be at work, and my grace is going to be ever present, and it's going to be abundant. And with his hands, through his leadership, the headstone, the roof will be put on. It will be completed. Headstone, maybe you think of it as a capstone. I remember when my wife graduated from Miami University of Ohio. In her senior year, she had to work on this thing called a senior capstone. And what it is it's the culmination of all that she had learned and all the skills that she had developed, sort of bundled together into this senior project, or as they call it, a capstone. It's the crown placed atop her years of study. It signified closure and completion to her studies. And she couldn't have done it without my help, right? Through this vision, God was guaranteeing Zechariah, and correspondingly to Israel and Zerubbabel and all that would listen, that the temple construction would be completed in Zerubbabel's day. He's guaranteeing it. Now know this. Don't ignore this. This is where the rubber meets the road. Labor would be made. There would be many hands involved. Plans would need to be developed and executed. There would have to be strategy, sheets, numbers, all of those things, statistics. But I want you to pay attention to the cry that would go forth upon the completion of this temple. When the headstone was put on and everybody's standing back and looking at it in its final form, notice the cry that is made. He says, grace, grace unto it. Not works, works, not deeds, deeds, not knowledge, knowledge, not wisdom, wisdom, not plans, plans, not meetings, meetings, not statistics, statistics, but what was the cry? Grace, grace unto it. It lets me know that I have a part, but He's got the power. All glory to Him. I'm a nobody compared to Him. You take Him out, we're still at the foundation. We haven't even plucked up the grass yet. And why is this? Because God's grace is the power, and it's the effectual means by which all of the efforts of Israel will come together and succeed. You want to see growth in your life? You want to see growth in your relationships? You want to see growth here at this church? There's got to be plans. There's got to be meetings. We can do all those things. A lot of hands on deck. We need the Spirit of God to show up. We need Him to work. And we need to rest. We need to not spaz out, but rest in His grace that He's working through it all in all. You might not see it or understand it or know its end from the beginning, but He does. Concerning His abundant labors and successful ministry, Paul spoke this same truth in 1 Corinthians 15. Verse number 10, he said this. He's looking back and reflecting upon what he had done. He said this, "But by the grace of God I am what I am. And His grace, which was bestowed upon me, was not in vain. But I labored more abundantly than they all." He said, with His grace, I labored more abundantly than anyone I know. Shipwreck at sea, nights in the cold, hungry, beaten. He labored in the gospel more than anyone he knew. But then he says this, "Yet not I, but the grace of God, which was with me." Paul labored, but it was the grace of God working in and through Paul that was bringing about success and completion. Speaking of his and Apollos' collective evangelistic efforts in Corinth, he said essentially the same thing. In 1 Corinthians 3, "Who then is Paul and who is Apollos but ministers by whom you believed, even as the Lord gave to every man?" But then he says this, "I have planted." Yeah, I planted the seeds of the gospel and the seeds of the truth of Jesus. I planted them. I planted them in your soul. I planted them in your heart. I planted them in your mind. And Apollos came after me and he watered that. Who made those seeds come out of the ground? Who gave the light and the warmth and the right environment, all the factors? God. God gave the increase. So although we labor, we don't need to get tired. We don't need to fret. I'm resting. God, you're going to do this. You're going to do it. Speaking of Jesus and what He would bring after His ministry, John the Baptist said this, "And of His fullness have all we received, and grace for grace." When you're back in Zechariah and it says grace, grace unto it, why does he say grace 2 times? Why not once? Why 2 times? Why grace, grace unto it? I believe it's the same reason that John says what he does in chapter 1, and grace for grace. It just doesn't stop, guys. It just keeps on coming. There is no limit. There is a forever, eternal supply, an unending supply of God's grace. Haggai makes it known when you read his prophecy. We looked at that a few weeks ago. He makes it known that this Zerubbabel of the seed of David, the rightful king of the Jews at the time, he was a signet or a symbol, meaning Zerubbabel, when you looked at him, at least from a certain perspective, he was foreshadowing or being a symbol of someone else. You know who that is? Christ. Zerubbabel is a type of Christ, who is our true king, and by whose grace we have salvation, purpose, and spiritual success. Can I encourage you, church, today, anyone visiting, Maybe there's just some things that you don't understand. God's working in some ways, trying to bring some things to light to you, and you've reached the point where it's a little cloudy. I'm not 100% for sure. We're going to have to revisit that. Rely on God's Spirit. Know that He's working in the midst. It's Him doing the work anyways through you. And rest in God's grace. Don't enamor yourself with the surmisings of man. All those things will fall into place, but rest in the grace of God working all in all. And then number 3, trust in God's promises. Trust in God's promises. Verses 8 and 9, he continues on and says this, "Moreover, the word of the Lord came unto me, saying, The hands of Zerubbabel have laid the foundation of this house. His hands shall also finish it, and thou shalt know that the Lord of hosts hath sent me unto you." Whether it's the nation of Israel, whether it's a local church, whether it is an individual believer, a Christian, God is supremely interested in the building up and the completion of them. He's not done with Israel. He's not done with His church. And if you're here this morning and you're saved, you know Christ as your Savior through faith alone in Him, He's not finished with you. He's got a plan for you. He has a purpose for you. Concerning Israel, think about this for just a few moments. We're trusting in God's promises. There in those few verses, He is guaranteeing, He's saying, Zerubbabel, you started the foundation, your hands will fulfill it. Your hands will finish it. Concerning Israel, He founded the nation upon His promise to Abraham, be a father of many nations. He saved them out of captivity in Egypt. He provided for them for 40 years in the wilderness. He gave them a promised land in Canaan. He established them among the nations, and He has preserved them for millennia in spite of constant threat and attack. Even though their nation, right now at this present moment, as a whole, they have rejected the Messiah. Their one true king, they have shunned Him, turned their back on Him. They have been cast off for a time. But are the Jews still God's chosen nation? Are they still His people? Absolutely. We can trust His promise. He's not going to go back on it. Concerning the church, He has promised to keep it and to protect it. I think of Matthew 16:18. "Thou art Peter, and upon this rock I will build my church, and the gates of hell shall not prevail against it." What is going to prevail against the church? Nothing. No one. No one. Come what may, Christ's church will endure. It will endure based on the promise of God. Not on the power of man, not on the might of many leaders, but by the promise of God, we trust that it will endure. He is building and adding to His body so many as will receive Him. He has promised to see it to completion, that glorious day when all members have been added and situated to His pleasing. And then lastly, concerning the individual, Paul worded the same truth this way. Basically, trust in His promise. He's not done working on you. Paul said this in Philippians chapter 1, "I thank my God upon every remembrance of you, always in every prayer of mine, for you all, making requests with joy, for your fellowship in the gospel from the first day until now, being confident of this very thing." Now, you could say that he's talking about the church at Philippi exclusively, but I take this to mean a little bit more, even to every individual believer. And he says this, "that He which hath begun a good work in you will perform it until the day of Jesus Christ." Not even you can escape God's promise. You can't do it. I don't know why you try, but you can trust in it. So many promises. We would be here for eternity looking at all the promises that's been given to the believer, to God's people. Trust those promises. Trust them. Cling to them. Hope in the assurance of their fulfillment. 3 things we can do when we we're a little unsure about what God's doing, rely on God's Spirit. Yeah, God's working in ways that you can't see and don't understand. Those senses, the spiritual discernment that you got, let them be exercised so that you can sense that movement, even if you can't see it. Rely on God's Spirit. Secondly, rest in God's grace. We work, we labor, we don't look to this, my friend. We use these things, but we trust that God's giving increase. We trust that He's working all in all. I can't tell you how many meetings I'm in and how much things I kind of got to think of. And then I go home and it's like, yeah, we got 14 loads of laundry left to do. I'm like, ooh. But God works all in all. God works all in all. One of my new really good friends, for those of you that watched the chapel services or were here on Wednesday night, did Pastor Tony Liuzzo do a great job? He really did. And he came up to me, one of the first things he said to me, he said, man, I don't know how you do it. And I'm not trying to speak to me, I'm just trying to say this. I don't. We don't. God works all in all. Rest in His grace. You don't have to see it all. And then lastly, trust in God's promises. Now, we're going to bring this to a conclusion. Because when you give these three big ideas, here's what I think happens. Oh, man, I'm inspired. Now, how do I do it? How do I rely on God's Spirit? How do I rest in God's grace? How do I trust in God's promises? Well, I think there's a few lasting words that can help to that and start your feet with some movement towards these things. Number one, I want you to look at verse 10. Don't let your eyes fool you. Don't let your eyes fool you. Don't be fooled by what you see. Verse 10, for who hath despised the day of small things? For who hath despised the day of small things? For they shall rejoice and shall see the plummet. That right there is talking about a plumb line being referred to measuring this temple or measuring the city. It's in reference to a previous chapter. But what he says next is very appealing with those seven. They are the eyes of the Lord which run to and fro through the whole earth. Know this, that God sees what your eyes do not see and what your eyes cannot see. Don't be fooled by what you see, because God sees, when He speaks to seven eyes, He's talking about His omniscience, about His all-seeing power. Not only everything presently, but past, present, and future. He knows it all. His eye is on the sparrow, and His eye is on you, and His eye is on every single situation. Know that God sees what your eyes do not see and cannot see. Israel was guilty. They were guilty of looking at this new temple foundation with sadness. Sadness because it was not set to be as big as the former temple. You know, they couldn't see all the diagrams and the drawings. They couldn't see the walls, but they looked at the foundation. They looked at this beginning part. But they could tell just by looking at the foundation that it wasn't going to be the same size as Solomon's temple. Haggai chapter 2, verse number 3 says this, kind of speaking to how they reacted, the Jews, when they saw the foundation for the first time. Who was left among you that saw this house in her first glory? And how do you see it now? Is it not in your eyes in comparison of it as nothing? And then Ezra speaks to this. Remember, Zechariah, Haggai, contemporary with Ezra. Ezra says this, when they had looked on this foundation. There were some that rejoiced, but in verse 12 of chapter 3 it says this, but many of the priests and Levites and chief of the fathers, who were ancient men that had seen the first house, when the foundation of this house was laid before their eyes, wept with a loud voice. You've seen what a work of the Lord could be before. You know what it was. And yet you weep because of what you see now. God's encouragement to Zechariah, God's encouragement to Zerubbabel, God's encouragement to the people of that day was this: who hath despised the day of small things? Do you believe that with a couple fish and a few loaves of bread that our God can feed 15,000 people? Do you believe that? I do. Don't despise the day of small things. What we see, we hear big people speaking big things. We see big challenges with big obstacles. We have big sins with big regrets. But what God sees is what matters. Don't let your eyes fool you. Secondly, keep praying. You're thinking, how can I put my best foot forward? How can I rely on God's Spirit? How can I really rest in God's grace? How can I trust in God's promises? Don't let your eyes fool you, and keep praying. Verses 11 and 12, then answered I and said unto him, what are these two olive trees upon the right side of the candlestick and upon the left side thereof? And I answered again, or what this means is he requested again. He asked the question again and said unto him, what be these two olive branches which through the two golden pipes empty the golden oil out of themselves? So he asked, no answer. Then he repeated that same question. Look, I don't want to stretch the scriptures, but I think there's enough there to at least say this. Keep praying. Keep asking. Maybe you ask. Maybe you spend a week in prayer. Maybe you spend a month in prayer and you still don't see anything. There's still no answer. You know what you do? You just keep on praying. How many of you have had a very heavy prayer request for years only to see God answer it many, many years later? Can you testify to that? Do you know why? Yeah, God's faithful. But could it also be that you kept praying? You kept praying. Pastor Tony, for those of you that don't know, he was here with us on Wednesday night. He was here with us last week for our school's chapel. And their younger son just overcame, by the grace of God, about a 2.5-year battle with a very aggressive leukemia, or not leukemia, but some sort of tumor, a cancer right on his heart. And basically the doctors, when they first found it, was the size of a miniature football and said, your son is more than likely going to die. And I have followed this man and their family in this journey, even from when we were in Sweden. And every day, every week, without fail, they kept on pushing it out. Please pray. Please pray. Please pray. And if you ask him, he'll say, this whole thing, it changed my prayer life. It changed my prayer life. Jesus said this, men ought always to pray and not to faint. If anything, this passage displays a hunger for a greater understanding, a desire to pursue truth. Zechariah didn't understand the vision at first, but he continued to seek answers. Yeah, I know it. You don't understand. Yeah, I know it. You don't see it. Yeah, I know it. You can't feel it. Keep praying. Keep talking to God, and he'll keep talking to you. Pray always, and lastly, be willing to wait on God's answer. Wait on God's answer. Verses 13 through 14. And he answered me and said, knowest thou not what these be? And I said, no, my Lord. Then said he, these are the two anointed ones that stand by the Lord of the whole earth. Remember, at the beginning of the chapter, Zechariah, he didn't grasp fully what this vision was that God had given him through this angel. But he inquired of its meaning, and God gave him some insight into it. He kept on asking, God gave him some insight. Then he inquired again, and God supplied a more direct answer here at the end as to what these two olive trees really represent. Who are they? What are they? What are they there for? Well, my guess is you could probably read 100 commentaries, and probably 90, 95 of them. Maybe you ask some other preachers. But the two anointed ones that he mentions there in verse 14, who are connected, I guess, to these olive trees symbolically, they certainly appear to be an allusion to Zerubbabel and Joshua the high priest. The two men in Israel at that time who held the two highest and most important offices in the nation. King, high priest. King, high priest. Through those two offices did God work and extend His grace to the nation, issue His benevolence to the nation, and intercede for the people of Israel through Joshua. Hence these golden pipes carrying the golden oil. I think what God's saying is this: I'm going to work through Zerubbabel. I'm going to work through Joshua the high priest. They're the leaders. My Spirit's going to go between. I'm going to bring some revelation. I'm going to say some things. My Spirit, along with my grace, is working in it to bring light to this people. That's what he's saying. That's the beauty of Zechariah chapter 4. And it's really ultimately a beautiful picture foreshadowing our holy King and high priest, Jesus Christ, who is the King of all kings, who sits in the holiest of holies at the right hand of God. As a king, he has all power in heaven and earth, and all authority has been given unto him. And through him we enter into the holiest of holies, even within the veil, and worship God with boldness and reverent fear. Along with God's Spirit, God's grace within us. Does God's plan for you seem a little fuzzy right now? Are you unsure of how God might be working in your life, in your church, in your family, in your situation or your circumstances? Pray. Keep praying and wait on God's answer. Even if you never come to a determination on the matter, God promises to supply us with a peace that passes our understanding. Yeah, you may never understand it to the greatest degree, but there will be a peace that passes or rises above and trumps even your greatest human understanding of whatever it might be that concerns you. Remember that, just like Israel in Zechariah's day, each of us have a purpose in the work of God, in the building up of His kingdom, in the structure of His body. We all have a place in the plan of God. We all have a part in this vineyard that He's working on. But God alone has the power, not by might, nor by power, but by my Spirit, saith the Lord of hosts. All to make it grow, to be effectual in it, and to bring it to a place of completion. Would you stand with me this morning? We'll have a time of response. Invitation. We invite you to contemplate the truths that have been presented. No one's going to be made a spectacle of. You can make decisions in your seat just as well as you can make them right up here. But we want to offer you a chance, an opportunity to think on these things while the pressure is still applied to the heart by the Spirit of God. Don't avoid it. Don't deny it. Be sensitive to it. We'll have a word of prayer, and Brother Winters will begin to sing. Our Father, we thank you for this day, this opportunity granted us. May you work even in the midst of us now, by your Spirit, by your grace. Amen.